The day the US realized it couldn't dictate to India. For months, the message coming out of Washington sounded simple: fall in line or pay the price. A 50% tariff, the harshest rate slapped on any major American trading partner anywhere in the world, sat on Indian exports like a warning sign nobody could ignore. Officials in Washington seemed to expect the usual outcome: a smaller economy quietly bending to pressure from the largest one. Instead, something unexpected happened. India did not fold. Today, we're going to walk through the months-long standoff between Washington and New Delhi, and the moment it became clear that pressure alone was not going to be enough to make India simply do as it was told. Before we get into how this unfolded, understand where it began. Relations between the United States and India had spent years warming, built on defense deals, technology partnerships, and carefully staged public appearances between leaders eager to project unity on the world stage. Then, almost without warning, that warmth turned cold. Washington announced a reciprocal tariff on Indian goods in the spring, paused it briefly, then escalated sharply through the summer, eventually stacking an additional penalty on top, explicitly tied to one issue: India's continued purchase of discounted Russian oil. By late summer, the combined tariff reached 50%, higher than the rate imposed on almost any other country, including nations that continued buying far more Russian energy than India did. New Delhi called the move unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable, language sharp enough to signal that quiet acceptance was not going to be India's response. The timeline itself tells much of the story. What began as a routine trade measure in early spring escalated step by step over the following months, each new announcement landing with less warning and more force than the last, until exporters, shipping companies, and government officials on both sides were left scrambling to understand exactly which rate applied to which product on any given week. For an economy the size of India's, absorbing that kind of unpredictability was not simply an inconvenience. It threatened contracts already signed, shipments already loaded, and relationships between individual Indian manufacturers and their American buyers that had taken years to build and could unravel within a matter of months if the uncertainty dragged on too long. What followed was not capitulation, but also not open confrontation. India's response was quieter, more calculated, and in many ways more revealing than a simple public standoff would have been. Rather than rushing back to the negotiating table on Washington's terms, Indian officials leaned into a different message entirely, one built around a decades-old foreign policy principle known as strategic autonomy. The idea that India chooses its partnerships and does not simply accept them as conditions imposed from outside. Just weeks after the harshest tariffs took effect, Modi traveled to China for a major regional summit, sitting alongside leaders Washington viewed with open suspicion and reaffirming ties with old partners at a moment when many expected India to be scrambling exclusively toward Washington for relief instead. Whatever the private calculations behind the timing, the public image was unmistakable, a country demonstrating quite visibly that it had options beyond simply waiting for American forgiveness. Officials in New Delhi were careful not to frame the China trip explicitly as a response to the tariffs, insisting the visit had been planned well in advance, yet the optics proved difficult to separate from the moment they landed in, with images of India's Prime Minister standing comfortably beside leaders in Beijing, circulating widely just as American tariffs on Indian goods reached their harshest level. At home, the government doubled down on a different kind of message as well, encouraging Indian consumers and businesses to buy domestically produced goods and reduce reliance on markets that had just turned openly hostile. This was not purely symbolic. Indian manufacturers in sectors hit hardest by the tariffs, from textiles to gems and jewelry, began actively seeking new buyers across Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, treating the American market as one important customer among several, rather than as an irreplaceable lifeline the entire economy depended on. Exporters who had spent years building relationships with American buyers found themselves navigating a genuinely difficult stretch, absorbing real financial pain. Yet the broader economic and political tone out of New Delhi remained remarkably steady, refusing to frame the tariffs as an existential crisis, even as the immediate costs mounted. Trade bodies representing small and medium exporters described months of anxious client calls and canceled orders, real hardship that no amount of confident government messaging could fully erase, even as officials publicly projected calm and pointed toward alternative markets as evidence the country was not simply standing still while waiting for Washington to relent. Inside the United States itself, cracks in the pressure campaign began appearing from an unexpected direction. Lawmakers from both political parties grew increasingly uneasy, watching one of America's most important strategic partnerships in Asia strain under tariffs that critics argued achieved little beyond alienating a country Washington had spent years courting as a counterweight to China. A bipartisan group of representatives introduced a resolution specifically aiming to terminate the tariffs, arguing the underlying legal justification amounted to government overreach and describing the strategy as counterproductive to broader American interests in the region. This was not simply Indian officials pushing back from the outside. It was a growing chorus inside Washington itself, questioning whether squeezing India this hard actually served the interests the policy claimed to protect. Business groups on the American side, particularly those representing technology and pharmaceutical companies with deep ties to Indian supply chains and talent pools, quietly lobbied for a faster resolution, warning that prolonged tension risked pushing India's government and its private sector alike toward deeper economic ties with other partners at exactly the moment Washington claimed to be courting India as a long-term strategic counterweight in the region. Then came a legal twist nobody fully anticipated. The United States Supreme Court struck down the broad emergency powers the administration had relied on to justify sweeping global tariffs in the first place, a ruling that forced the White House to scramble toward alternative legal authorities just to keep any tariffs in place at all. Even as officials insisted publicly that the India deal remained unaffected, the ruling exposed just how much of the original pressure campaign had rested on legal footing that turned out to be far shakier than initially assumed. Whatever leverage Washington believed it held over India, some of that leverage suddenly looked considerably less solid once courts weighed in on the very mechanism used to apply it. The administration moved quickly to preserve some form of tariff authority under a different statute, temporarily settling on a lower baseline rate while the broader legal picture continued sorting itself out, a scramble that underscored just how much of the original pressure campaign had depended on legal tools that were, at the time, far less settled than officials had publicly suggested. By early the following year, the standoff finally began shifting toward resolution, though not in the simple, one-sided way the original tariff announcement might have suggested. Trump announced a trade deal rolling back tariffs from Indian goods from 50% down to 18%, a dramatic reduction that Indian officials welcomed publicly and celebrated as validation of their steady, patient approach throughout the standoff. Modi's public response struck a notably warm tone, praising the American president's leadership and expressing support for continued cooperation between the two nations, language that reflected genuine relief at finally moving past months of costly tension, rather than any lingering resentment over how the standoff had unfolded. The joint statement accompanying the announcement outlined a broader framework, touching everything from industrial goods to agricultural products to defense cooperation, suggesting both governments were eager to move quickly past the standoff and rebuild a relationship that had, by most accounts, sustained real damage over the preceding months, regardless of how the final numbers were ultimately spun by either side. But here is where the story resists the simplest possible telling, because this was not purely a case of Washington backing down while India held firm on every front. As part of the same agreement, India committed to reducing its purchases of Russian oil and significantly expanding imports of American energy, technology, and agricultural products, concessions that addressed exactly the concerns Washington had cited when imposing the original tariffs in the first place. India also agreed to eliminate or reduce its own tariffs on a wide range of American industrial and agricultural goods, opening its markets in ways it had resisted for years during earlier rounds of trade negotiations. This was, in the end, a negotiated settlement built on concessions from both sides, not a story of one nation simply forcing the other to entirely reverse course. Indian negotiators reportedly pushed hard during the final weeks of talks to protect sectors they considered most vulnerable, particularly agriculture and dairy, areas that touch hundreds of millions of small farmers and have historically been treated as politically untouchable in Indian trade negotiations, regardless of which government happens to be in power at the time. That some of those sensitivities appeared to have been at least partially accommodated in the final framework suggests India entered the final negotiations from a stronger position than the opening tariff announcement might have implied months earlier. What makes this moment genuinely significant, then, is not that India emerged having conceded nothing at all, because it clearly did make real commitments Washington had been pushing for. What makes it significant is that India refused to make those commitments while under the maximum pressure of a 50% tariff hanging over its economy, choosing instead to absorb months of real economic pain, diversify its trading relationships, and demonstrate genuine independence before eventually returning to the table on terms it could describe credibly as a partnership between equals rather than a surrender extracted through coercion. The final tariff rate of 18%, while still a meaningful cost for Indian exporters, represented a fraction of the original pressure applied, achieved only after India proved it was willing to endure the alternative, rather than simply cave at the first sign of economic discomfort. Critics on both sides of the relationship have pushed back against triumphant framing of how this all concluded. Some analysts in Washington argued that India ultimately gave Trump much of what he originally wanted: reduced Russian oil purchases, expanded American imports, and greater market access, meaning the tariffs, however costly and controversial, arguably achieved their stated goals in the end. Trade experts on the Indian side cautioned that the finer details of the agreement remained unresolved for months afterward, with a fully binding, comprehensive trade deal still being negotiated well after the initial tariff rollback, leaving open the possibility that fresh disputes could reignite tension down the road. One trade policy expert observed publicly that the deal represented only a first phase, cautioning that meaningful resiliency in the relationship would require far more than a single announced framework, and that both governments still needed to translate broad political commitments into legally binding text capable of surviving future political shifts on either side. Diplomats who study the relationship closely have generally described the episode less as a clean victory for either side and more as a genuinely difficult stress test, one that exposed real vulnerabilities in a partnership that had until that point been described almost exclusively in glowing terms by leaders on both sides. Still, something did shift during those difficult months, something that went beyond the specific percentage points eventually negotiated. For years, the assumption in parts of Washington had been that India, however large and however important as a strategic partner, would ultimately behave the way smaller, more dependent nations often did under serious economic pressure, adjusting its foreign policy and its trading relationships to align more closely with American preferences whenever push genuinely came to shove. The months-long standoff tested that assumption directly, and the result was more complicated than either simple narrative, total defiance or total capitulation, would suggest. India absorbed real pain, diversified visibly, refused to publicly abandon its broader diplomatic relationships under duress, and only then negotiated terms it could present domestically as a partnership rather than an ultimatum accepted under threat. Think about everything this standoff actually revealed. A tariff campaign built on assumptions about how quickly economic pressure could reshape another nation's foreign policy. A country that refused to abandon its other relationships even while under the heaviest tariff burden faced by any major trading partner. A domestic manufacturing push treating hostile markets as one option among several rather than an irreplaceable necessity. Lawmakers inside the pressuring nation itself beginning to question whether the strategy served anyone's long-term interests. A legal ruling that quietly undercut the very foundation the pressure campaign had been built upon. And finally, a negotiated settlement built on real concessions from both sides, reached only after months of genuine economic pain had been absorbed rather than avoided. No single moment in this story fits neatly into a headline promising total victory or total defeat. But taken together, these months revealed something genuinely important about how the relationship between these two largest nations actually works when tested under real pressure rather than staged for cameras during a friendly state visit. Washington learned that maximum pressure does not automatically translate into maximum compliance, particularly when dealing with a country large enough, diplomatically connected enough, and economically resilient enough to absorb real short-term pain in service of a longer-term principle. And India demonstrated in the most costly and public way imaginable that strategic autonomy was not simply a phrase repeated in diplomatic speeches, but a genuine operating principle it was willing to defend, even when the price of defending it showed up directly on the balance sheets of its own exporters. Whether this particular standoff becomes remembered as the defining moment that reshaped how Washington approaches New Delhi going forward, or simply one difficult chapter within a much longer and still unfinished relationship, the underlying lesson seems unlikely to be forgotten quickly by either side. Pressure applied without genuine partnership tends to produce resistance rather than obedience, especially when the nation on the receiving end has spent decades building the kind of independence that makes simply waiting out the storm a realistic option rather than a desperate gamble. What lingers longest from those difficult months is not any single number on a tariff schedule, but the broader signal sent to every other capital watching closely from the sidelines. Smaller and mid-sized economies around the world, many of them facing their own version of the same pressure Washington applied to India, took note of how this particular standoff played out, weighing what it suggested about the limits of economic coercion when a targeted nation has genuine alternatives and the political patience to use them. Whether that lesson gets applied elsewhere in the years ahead remains to be seen, but for a few tense months in 2025 and into 2026, the relationship between two of the world's largest democracies became a very public test case for a question every nation with real economic leverage eventually has to answer. How much pressure is actually enough, and what happens when the answer turns out to be less than expected?